Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. So tonight we are doing a deep dive on vintage pens. We're going to have probably the bulk of it is going to be talking about vintage fountain pens, but because I don't collect fountain pens, I forced our guest to expand his definition of discussions into ballpoint and rollerball as well. So we are going to have hopefully a breadth of discussion this evening. Thanks to those of you who have already signed on and is starting at the right at the top of the hour. Got Katie from Vintage and Vinyl. Have a feeling you might have a pen collection, Katie. I don't know. You definitely that's the type of stuff I could see you collecting. We got Vintage and Craze. Vintage Crazed is also here, so I appreciate you joining us. So thank you for joining us, Sarah. Tonight is for those who are new to the deep dive concept. What we're going to be covering is not a sale. So this is a deep dive, just an interview. It is a live interview. And tonight's guest is from the Pen Market. Got his website running across the bottom. He is going to be talking about the history of pens, development of pens, going through the filling mechanisms of fountain pens, things that I do not understand at all. So if there's anything that people are curious about, want to learn more about, have questions about, because it's a live interview, you can enter questions into the chat. So join. You're already part of the Huckster Hecklers. You are welcome to ask questions. You don't have to. You could just hang out in the chat and watch the video, whatever you feel comfortable doing. But do remember that if you're watching this live on Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, you are seeing this as a live interview, so you do have that opportunity of answering questions. So the history of our guest, Nathaniel Cerf, is he is the owner of thepenmarket.com. He is actually, there is a triangle connection between Nathaniel, the Huckster Helper, my daughter, and myself, because Nathaniel was the Huckster Helper's fencing coach. So my daughter went to a school that required sports participation. Let's just say the Huckster Helper took after me for any sort of sports participation. So instead of being a regular joiner, she ended up participating in fencing, and she became the lone fencing team of her high school. And the sole fencing coach was Nathaniel Cerf. So Nathaniel had a full-time job. Actually, at the time we had met him. And then over the course of time, he developed his own interest and love of vintage pens, starting the pen market, and eventually turned that into a full-time business. And that is now, if I'm correct, Nathaniel, this is your full-time gig, correct?
This is my full-time gig, amazingly.
All right, excellent. I got a few more people joining in. We got Dawn Schonkweiler's joining in. Hey, Dawn, thanks for joining. So tonight, again, we're gonna kick things over to Nathaniel. And if you have any questions, need any clarification of anything he's talking about, throw it in the chat. I will try and monitor the chat. But until that comes up, I'm going to pass it over to Nathaniel.
Hi there, everybody. How you guys doing? It is so good to be here, and I thank Patrick for letting me be part of the Trusty Huckster Mercantile. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope to have some fun with you guys and show you some really neat, fun vintage pens that you probably encounter often in your vintage dives elsewhere. If you go to a lot of antique stores, flea markets, hang around eBay, you're going to find a lot of these types of pens. So let's go ahead and sort of jump right on into it. The pens themselves, I'm going to have a whole bunch of them here for you. But we'll go over the history of the pens a little bit and how people started. There was reeds and wet clay tablets in the early days, and then they started, developing inks, which if you want to lose yourself in really weird, crazy stuff, there's all sorts of different vintage ink recipes from the dawn of time moving forward that are highly poisonous, but lots of fun to leave indelible marks on the world. And most people start to really think vintage pens. They start to think of something like a dip pen. This would be something that you just have like a little glass bottle of ink, and you just sort of dip it in the ink, and you start to write with it. And it only writes for anywhere from a couple words to a paragraph or two. And you're probably going to see tons of these if you do a lot of vintage shopping type of stuff, especially at antique shops. Anything with a steel nib like this, you can see that there's sort of a regular steel And then there's also a little brass overlay on there. These types of nibs are actually pretty much worthless. So they're easily taken out of the pen and replaced. They actually break after only a few pages of writing with them normally. So they're very simple. If you find a dip pen that has a huge 14 karat gold nib on it, those are going to be worth something. But for the most part, your average steel nibbed or your tiny little gold nibbed dip pens really don't have a ton of value or anything like that.
And what era are we in looking at those dip pens? And then Jeannie is asking a question, asking in that particular example or examples of others, was Bakelite common? What type of materials would the dip pen, what era and what materials would these be in?
This is actually a modern one, so it's a modern plastic, not the Bakelite. The dip pens really got their start, I believe, as far as metal nibs go, I believe they got their start really in the 1700s into the 1800s. People like to think of the Constitution being written with a quill feather, but odds are they were probably writing with a steel nib. And if they still were using a feather at the time, it would be phased out very shortly, even in the United States. We have into the late 1800s, we had a lot of people were trying to find better ways to create a fountain pen. So they had something called eyedroppers, and eyedroppers are fairly rare, and I don't have any in stock at the moment, so I don't have one that I can show off, unfortunately. But basically all you had was just like a little hard rubber body with a gold nib on it, and you would unscrew the writing grip and then just fill the whole barrel full of ink with an eyedropper. And those were really came around starting in the 1870s for the most part, into the 1880s and 90s. They actually kept making them into the 1920s, but they were very leaky. They had a lot of problems, and they were problematic. And people began really spending time and money and brain power trying to figure out how to make pens better, because they wanted to be able to write much longer. They wanted to be able to write without spilling ink all over themselves. I restore so many pens, it's amazing. I got my hands clean in time for this show, but normally my hands are covered in blue and black ink from all the repair work that I'm doing. By the 1890s, you had a company out of Toledo, Ohio called Conklin, and they invented a pen that was called the crescent filler. And this you can see like a little, let me try to get that over my head so you have contrast there, but that crescent filling unit right there is connected to a rubber bladder. So you can push that down. It's going to crush a rubber bladder on the inside, and then you're going to stick it in ink, like an ink bottle, and then let go of the crescent, and that's going to inflate the ink sac, and that will help to fill the entire pen. These pens were made out of a hard rubber, and they were very fragile, but they actually worked very, very well. These nibs are a nice gold 14 karat gold nib, and they have something that collectors really like called flexibility, or flex. And it's tough to show here, but you can maybe see on my fingernail how the tines of the nib separate a little bit. This was for Spencerian handwriting, and the Spencerian handwriting method is that beautiful flowing handwriting style where you see the skinny lines go to really broad lines, and they shrink right back down, and they're very loopy with curlicues and such. That is Spencerian writing, and these pens were really designed for that type of special penmanship. And then also, there's a little safety catch on this, and it's right under the clip. I don't know if you can see my finger moving it or not, but there's a little safety that slides under it to keep it from being collapsed while you're writing with it or have it in your pocket.
Really quick, Nathaniel, we're hearing a little bit of an echo, and I didn't hear that when we tested before. Can you maybe turn down your volume from, I don't know if you're feeding back to yourself, or are you also watching on another device?
How's this? Is that better?
Talk again.
Is this a little bit better?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay.
Okay, so that's clear that up. And then the other question was, could you repeat What era are we talking about for that really cool crescent?
These came from the late 1800s, 1890s, and they made them into the 1920s, actually.
Excellent. Now, what material would that have been in the 1890s?
In the 1890s, these were hard rubber. They didn't have plastics yet. They were just on the verge of getting there, but they used hard rubber to make a lot of items that we would make out of plastic today.
And you said that was called a crescent filler?
That is a crescent filler because of this little gold crescent on the top of the barrel there.
And then what you said, there's a bladder inside. Wasn't that bladder, there are other ways to fill other than that crescent?
Right. That was the bladder that this crushes on the inside. That's made out of rubber, but it's a much more flexible rubber. And that is how you would fill the whole pen full of ink.
Excellent. Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's good. I'm glad you asked. So moving into the 20th century, you had a company called Shaffer, which got its start at around 1908. And Shaffer, they were sick to death of dealing with the crescents. Ooh, wait, sorry. One last little thing with the crescent filler. Mark Twain was the original spokesman for the company, and he called it his profanity saver because the crescent prevented the pen from rolling off his desk. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So was Crescent the brand also? You said he was the spokesperson. Was that the brand?
Conklin was the brand. Conklin. And they made the crescent filler.
And how common are those for those of us who are looking at, antique stores, running across? Are those pretty rare and expensive, or are those still actually fairly common?
Those are going to be a little bit different. They are they're harder to find. They can be inexpensive. You can find some, every now and again for $25, $50, something like that. But you're not going to find them in a lot of places frequently. And if you do, snatch them up because even the parts are going to be worth something. So people are going to be looking for them. They might pay you $25 for the nib or even more, depending on the pen and the size.
I know that part of your business is repairing pens, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this, but how would you know, looking at something like that, if it's still functional, if it's any good? Is it like just for parts, or can you tell by the, can you open it up and see the bladder?
That's a great question. The way to check it is you can try to work the little filler system there. You'll probably find that it just falls into the body or that it has resistance. Never force anything on any vintage pen. That'll just end up destroying the mechanisms on the inside. It's safe to say that probably all vintage pens are not working. It's not difficult to get them restored. It's not expensive to get them restored as a general rule. For something like a crescent filler or some of the pens I'm going to show you in a second, most of us repair people would charge about $30 to restore them. And then you might be able to turn around. If it's a really large one, the big ones are going to be the most valuable ones, the oversized ones. And some of those will sell for $500 to $1,000. So a $30 repair investment's worth it for, turning around, selling it later on down the line.
Fantastic. All right. Sorry, you were moving on to Shaffer.
No, that's on to Shaffer. So Shaffer came out around 1908, and they invented something called the lever filler. And this is a Shaffer. You can always tell a lot of Shaffers by the white dot. Sometimes it's on the caps, somewhere up on top or on the bottom, or sometimes it's on the flat parts. But Shaffer invented the lever filling pen, and you can see that little golden lever there on the side of the barrel. And it takes the same idea as the crescent filler with a ink sac inside of the barrel of the pen. But the difference is that there's a spring and a mechanism in there that you can turn around and get that lever pulled down. That will collapse the ink sac for you. But instead of, having this big hump coming out of the side of the pen, it just goes right back in and hides and stays out of the way. And these became extremely popular pens in the 19-teens and 20s in particular. Shaffer is based out of Fort Madison, Iowa, or at least they used to be, and they were one of the great American pen brands. Most people, we're going to find a lot of Schaffers in their searches for vintage pens out there. This is a lifetime nib, and that meant it was good for the lifetime of the original owner. So if your ink sac blew out when you bought this in 1926 or something, then they would just keep putting a new ink sac in it until you died. It was a pretty nice warranty that they had back then for their lifetime pens. They had some other ones that didn't have a lifetime warranty. They had some numbers you'll see on them. Sometimes you see a 730 or a 530 or a 525. And that meant it was like a $5 pen that had a 25-year warranty. So they would do repair work on it for 25 years.
So one of the questions that's coming in from Dave at Vintage Uprising is because he said he's got an old Shaffer pen. Were there dots, non-white dots? Did that
Right. So the pens that don't have a white dot on them did not have the lifetime warranty. And they were a much less expensive pen in the brand lineup. But that doesn't mean they are actually any different than the lifetime pens. They are actually the exact same pen. They have a slightly different imprint on their nib, but they write and work just as well as a lifetime pen would.
Excellent. Thanks. That's a great question, Dave.
That was great. Yeah.
Back up a step because again, I have a very large pen collection but they're all functional. I use all of them, but I don't have any fountain pens. So you're talking about the filling mechanism, and I guess I need to back up for my own edification. So like that one, when you raised that or opened up that lever, it seemed like there was almost no resistance at all. So at what point does it actually pull in the ink? So you're putting the nib into the ink pot? What exactly is the steps for this?
So when you put this in the inkwell, let's pretend my finger is the inkwell there, and now the pen is in imaginary ink. So what you're going to do is you just let this back. And there's actually an assembly on the inside of the pen that has a few springs that will crush the ink sac flat. And then when you release the lever and put it back into the pen, that's what releases those springs. They stop crushing the ink sac, and the automatic vacuum of the sac going back to its natural form in sort of a conical shape will suck the ink right into the pen. But you have to dip the pen all the way up to the black line, so that way it gets the most ink into the pen.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, great question.
And then if we go back to Dave's question or clarification about the lifetime versus non-lifetime, you're saying that the pens structurally are the same. So do they have a different value now? If you were trying to collect them or resell them, is the lifetime dot more valuable than the non-dotted ones?
The lifetime dot sometimes can get a little bit more money, but depending on the colors of the pen, sometimes if it's a really rare color that didn't come with a lifetime warranty, then that might be worth more than a green or a black lifetime pen would be. So some of it is based on color. This pen is actually an amazingly good example of what these pens look like when they came out of the factory. This is a really clean green. You're going to find a lot of these pens back in the shops that you run into are going to turn brown. Some of this green, the sulfur that was in the original ink sacs will leach out into the pen, and if the pen hadn't finished curing, the celluloid hadn't finished curing when they made it, then it would start to turn the celluloid brown. I have another example here of a different type of lifetime pen that is a torpedo shaped. It was more streamlined for the, you're right, it is tough getting the backwards camera action going. But this is a streamlined pen, and you can see it's kind of got some yellow and brownish hue to it. And that's because it started off originally as sort of a pearl white gray, and now it's discoloring from the off-gassing of the sulfur in the ink sac from the original time it was put together, and the celluloid hadn't quite finished curing.
Does the discoloration then affect the value? Would a pearlized one be more valuable than this off-colored one, or does it not really matter?
It does.
Okay.
The more pristine, if you get one of these, if you see one of these that is almost white, maybe not quite white, because it's almost impossible to find an actual white one, but it'll be white and black, with sort of a pearl sheen to it. And if it's almost white and black and not yellow and greenish, then those are going to be worth way more than the discolored ones.
And when you say way more, like double the price, 50%?
Well, we've got this guy here going for about $100, and if I had a pristine one, it would probably be about $250.
Okay. I agree with Katie. It's still pretty.
It is pretty. Thank you. And I love these things. These pens are so much fun that I think that, and they write better than 90% of the modern pens you get out there, then maybe even more than 90%. They're very fast. They're very fluid. They're gravity fed wet ink, so there's no resistance when you write. There's different sensations you get from the nibs. Some are going to be glassy smooth. Others are going to be kind of scratchy. Some people like the feel because they might do some, what do you call it? They might do some calligraphy or some Spencerian writing, and they need the feel of the paper to help them gauge how much weight and pressure to put on the pen. So they don't mind a little bit of scratchiness. But some people are going to write just their everyday normal handwriting, and they want it to be buttery smooth. And so there's different variables in some of the different nibs and the way they all feel. And then in the 1920s, they were really big on customizing pens for every different size person and hand. So you find you have really small ones. You find you have really large, oversized ones. Unfortunately, in today's market, everybody wants the large, oversized ones. Those are kind of rare. And people are a lot bigger than they used to be 100 years ago, too. We have better nutrition and all of that. So it's easier for people to write with a lot of the larger size pens. They made pens specifically for women, which I'm going to show you one here. And in the 1920s, a lot of women would have a fashion statement by wearing their pen on a necklace. And you can see the little necklace tassie right up there. And they would just keep it on a chain around their neck or something like that. Pens had fashion statement appeal, much like today's modern pens might. You know, you see a Mont Blanc in a store or on somebody at work, and you're like, oh, wow, that guy just really got a lot of money because he's running around with a Mont Blanc. It was similar with the white dot for a Shaffer. Parker also had a famous pen brand, and people would sort of pick sides like Chevy and Ford, and you know, it could be a fashion accessory as well as a practical writing instrument. And these were expensive in the time. I believe in the early 1920s, you could buy a Ford Model T for $100. A Shaffer like this one I'm showing you here might have gone for $7.50. So, you know, you figure that's, you know, 7% of a new car today. That would be a pretty expensive pen. So, you know, there was a certain poshness to the pens as well. This one is mistakenly referred to as a telephone dialer. For a long time, people thought that the black end on there was used to help use a rotary phone and dial, but it turns out it was just a design decision that they thought they would try for a year or two.
You were mentioning the Shaffer was the $7.50 compared to the price of a car. Was Shaffer then the premium pen? And then kind of like what were the names that were important then that would still be something we would do? They keep that same order now?
They do in many respects. Shaffer, Parker, and Waterman were all three major brands that were considered the elite brand of the 1920s and also into the 1930s. Some other brands came into the picture in the 1930s, like Wall Eversharp. Conklin remained a top brand into the 1930s. But those are sort of the big five, and they were really exceptionally well-made pens for their time, given the fact that I can still use one for my daily writer every day 100 years or more later. It's a good testament to the quality that they put into their pens. So that's a good question. Now, Parker, might as well go right over there. Parker was the ultimate fashion accessory because they were the first company to figure out how to make a pen that wasn't black, silver, or gold. There are a lot of different black, silver, and gold pens out there. Parker ended up making the first orange pen, and they called it the Big Red. Those sell out pretty fast, and I'm afraid I'm out of them at the moment, but their Big Red was a pen that was also called the Duofold. That was the model name for the pen, and this is a senior size Duofold in lapis blue. The lapis blue is much more rare than the Big Reds were, and it's actually a little bit more expensive if you find one. The ultimate in Parker pens from the 1920s is a senior size like this, which is about a 5.5 to 6 inch pen. They changed in size every year, but if it's bright yellow, it's mandarin yellow, some of those pens can go up for $1,200, $1,500. So keep your eyes out for yellow Parker Duofolds. Parker had their own lifetime warranty basically at the time. And here's their nib. You can see that a little bit better. But instead of using a lever filler or a crescent filler, they had a hidden blind cap in the tail. And this is a little button. Now, this little button, you push that in, and that will go ahead and crush a spring assembly system on the inside, just as the lever filler would, except this one is hidden. And that button filler is the way they actually fix these and fill those pens. So it's the same idea, just a little bit different in nuance. But they're a lot of fun. I like them a lot. Parker was the other major premier brand. So, you know, it's sort of like, you know, what's better, Mercedes or BMW? Everyone's got an opinion, but they're both pretty much the two top tier cars of the modern era. Same goes for Parker and Shaffer for pens back then.
Now, you were mentioning the Duofold and highlighting be on the lookout for the color. How are the pens themselves marked, both the Shaffer and the Parker? Where would you find the name, or would it actually say Duofold, or is this something you just need to know the look of?
I don't know if it'll be easy enough to see on this. It might be really hard, but there's a little imprint on the barrel. This is the Shaffer, and you can see usually it says W.A. Shaffer, Fort Madison, and then some patent information and stuff like that. You'll have that on the barrel. On the Shaffer, you have it written on the clip of the pen as well, so that will help to identify it. And then you get the same with Parker. You can see that they have Parker written on the clip, and then it's also, they find it on the barrel here. They're even courteous enough to write Duofold on there, so you know it's a Duofold for certain.
Excellent. And we have a question that came in from Harry Humstone. You had mentioned, I think in passing, you were saying that the celluloid would change colors. At what, were they always celluloid? Was Bakelite a material that pens would have been made out of, or based on what era we were in?
The Bakelite is one of the misconceptions about the vintage pens. Most people thought they were made out of Bakelite, especially because they might discolor and look like actual Bakelite when they were really discolored. However, they used hard rubber, and then they started moving over to celluloid. I actually have one of the first celluloid pens ever made right here, and so that's a perfect segue. This is a brand that's extremely rare called LeBoeuf. I don't know if you can see that on the clip there. It was a family brand that was made in Massachusetts, and they were the first to figure out how to make and cure a celluloid for a fountain pen. Now, this one is actually very close to its original color. There's a little bit of discoloration on the ends, but for the most part, it really started off as this sort of honeycrisp yellow, a very light yellow, and then a dark sort of brownish vein that would run through it. These pens are extremely hard to find, and if you can find them, and if you find them for an affordable price, don't even think twice about it. Snatch it up. The oversized ones go for up to $2,000–$3,000. The small ones only go for $150 or so, but if you can find the big one like this, it's a really nice treasure to have, either for yourself or for reselling purposes. This type of pen used a sleeve filler, and here the whole barrel just slides back, and then there's a rubber ink sac that you can see in there, and then there's like a little squeeze bar that you just press to help fill it up.
Can you give the name again of that brand?
This is called Le Boeuf. It's French for the beef, but it is a. Can you give the name again of that brand? This is called. So does that? Can you see that? Okay.
I can see there's something on there, so I can see the LEB. I can't see the rest. So
okay.
So Le Boeuf.
So yeah, it's Le Boeuf. It's the French spelling of beef.
Excellent. Now, one of the things, and you might cover this later, but we've seen several of these now that have the caps. Most of these have twist-on caps, correct?
Correct. Up until the 1940s, all pens pretty much had either a screw-on cap or something they called a slip cap. And a slip cap is kind of like the caps that snap on, but they didn't have any snapper on it. So it would just slide on and off. But they broke very easily, so they're hard to find. So most of the ones you're going to find from that era are going to be screw top caps.
And that actually leads to one of the questions is a lot of the screw top caps that I've seen when I'm out looking, and I do not carry pens, fountain pens, but a lot of times they're cracked because they appear to have been over tightened or something like that. And there's a split in the cap. How much does that affect the value?
It'll affect the value. It's better to get one that is not cracked. Part of the problem is the celluloid gets fragile on the lip of the cap over time. So pen collectors never post the cap. You never want to stick the barrel inside the cap because it'll push the boundaries of what's left of its flexibility and then crack it. And then that'll lead to that problem.
Okay. So I misunderstood how they got cracked. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very rarely from over tightening.
So I misunderstood how they got cracked. That makes sense.
So next up, we have the Parker Vacuumatic. Now, in 1929, Parker decided to really start to branch out in their ability to design more improved technology for pens. And in 1929 to 1932, they spent $125,000 of that era's money to do the research and design of this pen called the Vacuumatic, which is more than $2 million today. And when you consider that was the height of the Great Depression, that's a lot of money to invest in a filling system for a fountain pen. Now, this has a little pump. And it's actually, although it's really difficult to tell with the way the lighting is set up, this whole barrel is hollow and you can see through it. And then when you pump this piece down here, you pump it about 10 times, 12 times, and it uses a vacuum pump to suck up all the barrel full of ink, and then you can hold way more ink than any sack filling pen ever could. So it was a really neat invention that was really vital to the development and for Parker pens to stay in the black during the Great Depression. People who still had jobs and money really loved them, and they started buying them. They came in about 5 different colors. This is sort of an amber color. They have these really neat sort of stripes that are the celluloid. And then you can see it kind of catch the light a little bit there. Let's see if I put it closer to the light. There we go. But they also came in a blue, a green, a gray, and a burgundy reddish pink color. If you can find the reddish pink colors, those go for a lot of money too. This pen is about $100, but a burgundy one, the same way in perfect condition, might go for $350 to $500. This pen is about $100, but a burgundy one, the same way in perfect condition, might go for $350.
Assuming they were patented, these new filling mechanisms. So did it change the way other makers were trying to make their filling mechanism? Did they pressure to change?
Oh, absolutely. Shaffer then quickly moved over to a filling system that did not really work, and I don't have any with me at the moment, but it was a special vacuum filler, they called it, and it is in modern Italian Visconti pens today, but the problem with it is that you can't restore it. It was never designed to actually be restored. It was designed to last for the lifetime of the owner and maybe their children. Unfortunately, a lifetime turned out to be about 3 years, and then most of them all started falling apart. And then Shaffer had to spend a fortune handing out free pens as replacements for all the lifetimes that broke. So that was one of the big problems with the innovation there. Parker, though, kept innovating, and so did Shaffer, but Shaffer kind of enters a dark period here for a lot of their designs. They didn't do as many cool things with a lot of the pens as they could have until about the late 40s, early 50s. So they lost a lot of market share to Parker at that time. Parker then, in 1939, finished a pen that they would name the 51. And the 51 fountain pen is a very streamlined, very modern looking pen. It has a hooded nib. There's actually more gold in that tiny nib. It just goes way deeper into the pen, but it's more gold in that nib than any other Parker nib made before this. But the hooded nib allowed for a special ink feed system that has a ton of little ink collectors on there, and it wouldn't leak or drip the way other pens might from time to time from gravity-fed issues and stuff like that. Plus, it would stay wet and not dry out for extremely long periods of time. You could actually put one of these pens on your desk, run to the bathroom without putting the cap on, and then it'll still write the second you pick it up and start writing with it again. But it would do that for not just a bathroom break. I've had some of them that I could do that with and just leave it overnight and pick it up again the next morning, and it's still writing perfectly fine. The original ones had what they called 2 jewels. Now, this one's got a jewel on the cap, which is a fake pearl. It's just plastic, really. And then there's another little jewel on the tail. The double jewel pens are the early models from the very beginning. And these are going to have a lot more value than the single jewel ones where you have a jewel on the cap but no jewel on the tail. The first ones also had the vacuum fillers. So they were filled up the whole barrel with ink, and it was a really nice feature. This particular model is called the Yellowstone, although most collectors refer to it as the mustard yellow pen. These are one of the rarest colors, so these go for a lot of money. You're going to find mostly, you'll probably still find a lot of these at antique stores and flea markets, but they'll probably be black or blue or gray or something like that. But they're excellent pens, and they have different caps. Some of them are gold plated. If you can find one that's got a solid gold cap, that'll be worth a small fortune. There's also some sterling silver and stainless steel that they called blustraloy. It had a kind of a weird little finish that they kind of made it kind of like a frosted window finish on the steel that was called blustraloy. This is a lustraloy cap, although in the glare of the light, you can't really see the frosted look. Now, by the late 1940s, then Parker changed their filling mechanism, and they, quote unquote, invented what they called the aerometric filler. But if you'll notice, it's just like the sleeve filler on the LaBeouf pen from the 1920s. People really liked this filler, though. It was no mess, no hassle, no nonsense. You didn't have to worry about a diaphragm going out. They stopped using hard rubber, or not hard rubber, but soft rubber on the ink sac, and they started using something called ply glass, which was really basically just a silicone ink sac. But these came out in 1948 and 49, and these are still working. I have some replacement ones just in case I have to fix one, but this is one of the few types of rare vintage pens that is still going to work as good as new with the original ply glass filling. This is the Parker 51. I see there was a question on that. So the 45 was very similar, but it had a more exposed nib. And then it came out in the late 50s, early 60s, so it had a little bit more of a late 50s, early 60s sort of industrial design, a little bit more squared on the ends. Great question, though.
And one of the things, just so we're keeping an eye on our time, so you said we're basically hitting into the 50s to the 60s. At what point do fountain pens either lose their luster? At what point do rollerballs and ballpoints start entering the picture and fountain pens start losing some of their market share?
So Also another great question. Ballpoints really started in World War II. They were invented shortly before that in the 1930s. And pilots in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, really loved the ballpoints because they didn't have any air pressure problems compared to fountain pens. Unfortunately, the original ballpoint pens wrote terribly, and they hadn't figured out the oil. A ballpoint pen uses an oil-based ink, and that will end up hardening. And they hadn't figured out in the 30s and 40s really how to fix that yet. So in the 40s, Shaffer and Parker both started releasing pens. The first pen that actually successfully had the ink recipe right was the Parker Jotter. So you guys might have one of those, or 2 or 3 or 4 of them at home. They've been making them, and they've been in constant production since the mid-1950s, and they're a great ballpoint pen that you can really count on. I wish I had one to show off. I have a 1960s Shaffer ballpoint. They didn't go with the clicker like Parker did. Their clicker was in the clip, and you can actually work the pocket clip to extend and retract the ballpoint refill. Heading back to the 1950s for just a second, there's another brand you're going to find a lot at different antique stores. This is going to be called the Esterbrook. Esterbrooks were very popular in the 50s. They were probably the most sold pen on the market at the time. They came with a cheap steel nib that for the most part can be really scratchy, but they also made 3 dozen different nibs. So you can actually unscrew the nib system and then just put in a new one and screw it right into the pen. And people loved it, so they could, alter it and make it as customized as possible, which wasn't a possibility with a standard Parker or Shaffer. So that was kind of a neat thing. At an antique store, you can find a lot of these things for 15, 25 bucks. And they're nice little pens, but fully restored, they only sell for about 39 to 50 or 60 bucks, depending on what they are. Obviously, the rarer ones end up getting more, but the rare ones are pretty hard to find, and you usually don't turn them up in flea markets and antique shops. They were great workhorse pens, that's for sure. We were talking a little bit about ballpoint pens. Those got their start. Really, they got good by the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, they really started pushing out all of the fountain pen manufacturers. Parker and Shaffer were so convinced in the superiority of the fountain pen. They certainly continued to make ballpoints, but they were sort of given short shrift. They still focused on the bread and butter of the really beautiful fountain pens. But by the 1960s, people were really getting sick of the fountain pens. They still made some. The Parker 61 came along, and they distinctively have the little arrow by the nib there. The original ones had a capillary filler. It was the last major filling system. Unfortunately, I do not have a capillary filler on this, but basically it was just a little thing you dunked in ink. There was like a cotton wadding on the inside, and it just sucked up ink into the pen, and then it was gravity fed and wrote very easily, and it was completely mess free. This is a later model 61 with a cartridge converter system, and you can actually take out the converter and put in a plastic ink cartridge. And even though this was made in the 1960s, you can get modern cartridges that fit these pens.
And what would you say at this point is your most popular pen to sell? Because I know you sell through, obviously, the penmarket.com. Mm-hmm. What are people collecting? What are people using? Dave just shared that what you were showing was his daily writer. What are you seeing as collectability versus purchasing for daily writers?
I highly recommend making any pen you own your daily writer if you like it. They write beautifully. They're great. I would think, to answer the question of what I sell the most, I probably sell more Esterbrooks every year than any other pen. There's a lot of cachet with the baby boomers. Most of them had high schools that required them to use Esterbrook pens for their various classes. They were also required by various journalism and shorthand schools for different note-taking and dictation type of writing styles, like the Gregg shorthand method and stuff like that. So I sell the most, probably, as far as that is concerned, with Esterbrook. But I have collectors who go for the obscure, who go for Parkers and Schaffers, there's like a bajillion different things, so it's tough to highlight any one thing. But I would think that Esterbrooks are probably the safest bet for what I sell on a routine basis. By the 1970s and 80s, people started moving from ballpoint pens, and they developed a new type of cartridge refill for these pens called a rollerball. So rollerball pens have a ballpoint refill, it looks like, and they're often mistaken for ballpoints because it's just sort of a cartridge that looks very much like a ballpoint cartridge would. But the rollerballs are actually either a gel or a water-based writing system, writing ink on the inside. This is a gel one, but then there's also ones that use water-based ink. It's fountain pen ink that they just put into a ballpoint assembly, and they write much more smoothly than a oil-based ballpoint system does. Generally, you can tell the difference because a ballpoint pen won't have a cap. They don't dry out, so you have the clickers, or you have like a twist that the barrel twists, and you have that work out. And then you have the roller balls almost always have a cap, unless they're a capless roller ball, which is just ornery and confuses everything.
Now, one of the things that I know just from working with you in the past, and because I have my own collection, they all happen to be ballpoint. That I know really quick. So probably the most expensive pen I have is this Curtis pen. This is actually my newest acquisition. I got this from the pen market.
Thank you.
Nate has already signed off from New Zealand, but this is actually an Australian pen, but it is a ballpoint. There's been, when we were I was picking up different pens. I've got a North Point. I buy them basically for their aesthetics. This is one of the capless roller balls that I happen to have. We've talked about what kind of the going in the 80s and the 90s, what became the status symbols. And to me, Mont Blanc was always one of those, like, hey, you've got a Mont Blanc, you're wearing your wealth. But I know you're not a big fan of Mont Blanc.
I think the Mont Blanc is probably on the overrated side. They are beautiful pens. There's no denying that they certainly have a luxury and beauty about them, but they're also a status symbol. And even though they are a status symbol, they don't actually necessarily work as well as a lot of other brands do. They are well known the world over, and Mont Blanc has a brilliant marketing department. And I have a friend of mine who's a chemical engineer, and he was at an engineering conference in Mexico City, and he saw everybody was running around with these Mont Blanc pens, and he knew nothing about Mont Blanc pens at the time. And he was looking at them and talking to some of his friends there, and they're like, those are gorgeous. I love these pens. Can I see one? And they showed him their pen, and they were happy to let him fawn over it. And he goes to the store at the Mexico City airport, and there's a Mont Blanc boutique there. And he's like, ooh, I want to buy one of these. And he picks out, a basic model. And they're like, oh, that's $450. And he's like, you're kidding me. And they're like, oh, no, sir, these are very prestigious, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, give that to me again. And he looks at it, and he's like, oh, okay, well, that's gold plating. And they call it precious resin, but it's really just plastic. And it's like, yeah, it's probably like $13.50 worth of parts and labor into that ballpoint pen. But they're selling it for $400. And they're very brittle. They drop. If you drop one, they break very easily, and it's a very costly thing. This is the Legrand model rollerball. It's a nice pen. They work, pretty well. I mean, there's not like a major issue with the refill or anything like that. But at the same time, it's sort of you're spending a lot of money, but you're mostly paying for the prestige of having a Mont Blanc. And there's nothing wrong with that. I certainly will carry one into an interview or something like that, because then they automatically know what a Mont Blanc is, and it's such like, oh, you must be a high roller, so you just spent $1,000 on that pen. So clearly, you know what you're doing and you're successful. But at the same time, if you buy them on the secondhand market, you can actually get them for way, way, way cheaper, because they haven't changed their designs in up to 50 years. So it's a good way is to buy an inexpensive one, and then any little scratches and scars on it are just from your own experience, and no one's really going to know the difference.
So if someone is looking to start out, whether they're looking for a prestige pen or just they want to start a collection, just being sensitive to coming to the top of the hour, where would you start somebody, either with brand or filling mechanism? Where would you suggest somebody starting?
I always recommend people follow their own interests. If they're interested in just a good fountain pen, I would say check out a Shaffer. Schaffers, I think, had some of the best nibs of the 1920s and 30s. You can find good ones that are gold nibs and all of that for $50 to $100, fully restored, and they're going to be a great way to experiment a little bit. You can't go wrong with a Parker. They're also going to be good. I got into it through filling systems, so I just started, I started writing with one when I was 9, and it was my grandfather's, and I loved it. And then when I learned that there were more filling systems out there, then I just started geeking out and trying to get one of every filling system I could get my hand on, just so I could try them out and play with them and see what I thought. For modern pens, I highly, highly recommend, if you want sort of like the top end experience, but it's a little cheaper than Mont Blanc often. Especially if you get them secondhand, is a company called Pelikan. They're a German company, and they usually have stripe-colored barrels that are green or blue. Older ones were red. Some have black. There's like a little Pelikan family on the top of the cap. These, I think, are some of the best writing pens. So if you just want a really amazing, great writing pen, they have a filling system that they've had since 1932, and I just made a little bit of a mess because I forgot it was full. But there's a little piston in there that you can make go up and down with that end piece. Let me grab a Kleenex here. But the Pelikan is great. I highly recommend them for modern pens, modern luxury pens. You're definitely gonna get your money's worth with a Pelikan compared to some of the other ones. So yeah, you're definitely gonna get your money's worth.
Dave is also suggesting the Lamy, and I remember I purchased my first Lamy actually from Nathaniel.
Yeah.
So I got my name. I've got a rollerball Lamy, but this was his. I think he was doing a pen. Nathaniel was doing a pen show. My background is in sales. I don't really know anything about pens, but he lost his helper and for a day, and so I came in and I started selling his Lamy pens, and I liked them, so I bought one. But I bought a rollerball. I don't think they do a ballpoint, so I bought.
They do a ballpoint. Yeah, Patrick is actually the world's greatest pen salesman who's not a professional pen salesman. He ended up selling out, I think, half of our Lamys that day. And the Safari, which is the base level fountain pen really for Lamy, is a spectacular pen. They take a licking and keep on ticking. I use them for traveling, and I've put them through hell, and they just keep on going. I won't say they're indestructible, but you got to run over them with a car to do any damage to them. So they're pretty good pens, whether they're plastic or the aluminum metal ones. They're great.
I'm going to throw up a question that's coming in from Auntie Christy. Is that what I sign my postcards with? So anyone who's purchased from me receives a card, which is hand signed, and it's signed at the time I send the package. So I try and personalize it sometimes. Sometimes it literally is what I have in my pocket that day. So today my packages are going out. This is actually one of my favorite pens. This one is the, what was this? This was the Signum. It's almost always a ballpoint because that's what I use as a daily pen. I will absolutely match my pens to what I'm wearing. So mock me if you want. But I was wearing gray jeans and a pink shirt today. So I had my gray marbled Signum. When I wear blue, I've got the blue North Point, because that to me is just one of the most beautiful pens that I own. Maybe second to this green that has that just absolutely amazing, almost like the guilloche enameling, in the cover. So when I sign, it's literally whatever I got. And admittedly, a couple times it is the free pen I got when I bought my Hyundai. So it's not always the top of the line pens that I'm signing with. We did have another question that came in from Katie of Vintage and Vinyl. She's asking where you buy your ink.
I get ink. Well, I'm a Lamy distributor, so I actually have Lamy ink available for sale, but I get ink lots of different places. You can get Waterman makes great ink for just everyday writing, in addition to Lamy, of course, but Parker makes a good one. Parker and Waterman are the same ink these days. Mont Blanc makes ink, of course, but it's way overpriced. There's a company, if you really want to get into vibrant, crazy colors, there's a company called Diamine out of England, and they make amazing colorful inks, and they do lots of fun stuff, and they are stable inks. Some inks that you get from a company called like Noodlers or Private Reserve, they're beautiful inks, but they can do a lot of damage to your fountain pens. They either clog up or they eat the old rubber ink sacs. If you have an old rubber ink sac, you really want to kind of stick to a blue or a black. Unless you want to clean it out right away. The red and the green inks are very corrosive to rubber, and they will eat a hole through it. So you don't want to, I mean, if you're going to write your Christmas cards and you're going to take a week to write all your Christmas cards, fill it with green or red ink, that's no big deal. But when you're done writing your cards out, you're going to want to empty out the pen, fill it with water a bunch of times, and get as much of the color out as you can. Just so that way it doesn't keep eating away at the rubber on the inside of the pen.
Excellent. Well, we're basically coming to the top of the hour. I know you mentioned that you're a Lamy distributor, so you carry the Lamy ink. Do you carry any other ink beyond that?
I don't carry any other ink at the moment. It would be great to, but I used to go on the show circuit, but since COVID started, there's been no pen shows. So there's not a lot of need for me to stock up on tons and tons of inks, just because it very rarely sells, and it's very expensive to ship it. So I don't have a lot of the other ink brands yet. There are some people out there that do a great job, have tons of ink for sale, and probably have better deals on shipping it. But I'm trying the Van Ness pens. They're out of Little Rock, Arkansas. Friendliest folks you'll ever meet, and they have the world's largest collection of ink for sale that I've ever seen. So it's worth giving them a check if you're looking for lots of different colors and options.
Excellent. Well, I know at my behest, when I have guests on this deep dive, we don't talk about sales, or we're not selling anything. It's not a live sale. But you obviously have the penmarket.com. You are selling your pens. Mm-hmm. The pens that you showcased today, are a lot of those for sale, or are those from your personal collection?
I think almost all the pens I showed today are actually for sale. Yeah.
Fantastic. So why don't we wrap things up? Let everyone know where they can find you on social media.
I'm on Facebook, and then I'm also at thepenmarket.com. One of the fun things that we do at thepenmarket.com is not just trying to push pens on people, but we have a lot of fun with something that is our blog, really. I call it Drippy Musings. But one of the things we do is, in addition to writing about various pens, various inks, some repair tips, some cleaning tips, we do things that are fun, like what pens are in what movies. If you see a movie and there's a pen in it, what's Fred Astaire writing with in this one movie, or something like that. Since the coronavirus pandemic took over the world, we've also started something called the Decameron Project. And myself, I'm a writer first and foremost before I started owning a pen company. And my dad's a writer, and I'm friends with a lot of writers. And we have all started writing lots of free short stories for people to read to keep themselves entertained on our blog at thepenmarket.com. So we've probably got about 50 different short stories up right now. They span everything from ghost stories to science fiction. So whatever your pleasure is, we try to reach out for it. Everything from ghost stories.
Fantastic. I hope everyone can check out your blog, check out your site, and if anyone's building their collection or starting a new one, I highly recommend the penmarket.com. I've spent a lot of money there, and it's Nathaniel, as you can tell, is very knowledgeable and is very open with his information to help you out and help you make the right decision. So I want to thank Nathaniel for joining me this evening. I want to thank all the Huckster Hecklers for joining in the chat and asking the questions. Appreciate all the input, and I hope you enjoyed this evening. So again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. Everybody have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Patrick, for having me. I really enjoyed my time.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.